600 years is a long time to be at the top of anything. The Vorath had been there for all of it. Not through the careful construction of political relationships or the patient building of alliances that most civilizations use to accumulate influence. Those strategies required a degree of mutual dependence that the Vorath had never needed. Their dominance was simpler and older and more absolute than anything diplomacy produced. They were the strongest thing in the space they occupied, and they had been that for 6 centuries, and the space they occupied had grown steadily across those centuries because nothing had ever given them a reason to stop expanding it. The Vorath High Council was the oldest continuously functioning governing body in the known galaxy. Its institutional memory went back further than the written records of most civilizations that were currently applying for coalition membership. The Council had seen empires form and fragment. It had watched species achieve jump capability and begin their expansion into the wider galactic community, and had assessed each one in turn and filed each assessment in the same category, another civilization entering a galaxy that the Vorath had been the primary fact of for longer than most of them had been keeping records. The assessment process was thorough and professional. The Vorath intelligence apparatus had been refined over centuries into one of the most capable analytical organizations in the galaxy. When a new species appeared on the edge of known space, the apparatus ran its standard protocols, identifying the species, evaluating its technological level, assessing its developmental trajectory, projecting its likely growth over the following decades, and producing a report that gave the High Council the information it needed to decide how the new species fit into the existing order of things. The reports almost always reached the same conclusion. New species. Early developmental stage. No strategic significance at this time. Monitor and reassess at standard intervals. This conclusion was not laziness. It was the honest product of 600 years of accurate assessment. The Vorath's analytical framework had been built on the accumulated data of hundreds of species, and the data showed that new species entering the galactic community followed recognizable patterns. They grew. They developed. They reached various levels of capability depending on their specific characteristics. None of them had ever reached a level that changed the fundamental picture of who occupied the top of the galactic order. The framework was accurate because the conclusion it produced had always been accurate. Humanity filed its first contact notification in what the Vorath calendar recorded as the 419th year of the current High Council's administrative period. The notification came through the standard channel, a species achieving jump capability and making contact with the nearest inhabited system and formally announcing its presence to the galactic community. The Vorath received copies of all first contact notifications as a matter of course. Their position in the galactic order made them relevant to every new entry into that order, even when the new entry was not directly adjacent to their territory. The assessment team lead was a senior analyst named Assessor Drev, who had been processing first contact assessments for 22 years. He assigned the humanity file to one of his mid-level analysts with the standard brief, full developmental assessment, projected trajectory, strategic significance evaluation. The analyst completed the report in 11 days. It was 4 pages. This was on the shorter end of standard assessment length, but not unusually short. First contact assessments for species in early developmental stages often ran short because there was simply less to document. The species was new. The data was limited. The trajectory was expected. 4 pages covered it. Drev reviewed the report, found it accurate and complete, and forwarded it to the High Council's Intelligence Review Board with his endorsement. The review board received it on a Thursday. The council had a full session that Thursday covering 6 items of significantly greater immediate relevance: a border negotiation with a mid-tier civilization in the eastern systems, an internal infrastructure review, 2 trade corridor proposals, and the ongoing management of a political situation in the northern cluster that had been requiring attention for 3 months. The humanity assessment was the 6th item. The council reached it approximately 40 minutes before the end of the session. The board chair summarized the report verbally in the format used for low-significance items: species name, location, developmental stage, strategic significance rating, recommended monitoring interval. The summary took about 3 minutes. The council members who were still fully engaged with the session at that point in a long agenda listened, asked no questions, and indicated their receipt of the information in the standard way. The chair moved to close the session. Nobody mentioned humanity again in that session or in the 7 sessions that followed over the next several months because there was nothing about humanity to mention. They were in the standard monitoring rotation. Assessments would be filed at standard intervals. The apparatus would report any significant developments if they occurred. No significant developments were expected. The Vorath went about the business of being the dominant civilization in the known galaxy. There was always business to go about. 600 years of dominance did not maintain itself without ongoing attention, and the High Council was a functional and experienced body that understood this and managed its responsibilities accordingly. In human space, something else was happening entirely. The humans who had just filed their first contact notification had been aware of the broader galactic community for approximately 12 years before the notification, the time between their long-range sensors first detecting evidence of other civilizations and their achieving the jump capability that made formal contact possible. 12 years during which they had looked at the galaxy they were about to enter and thought carefully about what they were looking at. What they were looking at was a galaxy with established powers, established hierarchies, and established assumptions about how things worked and what position new species occupied in the order of things. Humans had looked at this and had a reaction that the Vorath assessment framework would not have predicted because the framework had never needed to predict it. They found it interesting. Not intimidating. Not paralyzing. Interesting in the way that a complicated problem is interesting to someone who has spent their entire history becoming very good at complicated problems. The Vorath analyst who wrote the 4-page report filed it accurately and professionally and went on to the next item in his portfolio. 7 years passed. The High Council did not think about humanity in those 7 years in any meaningful way. The monitoring rotation produced 2 brief update assessments, and both update assessments said the same thing as the original: development continuing along expected lines, no significant change, no elevated strategic significance. Both were accurate descriptions of what the Vorath analytical framework was capable of seeing. Both missed the thing that the framework had never been built to see. The thing was still developing. It was developing quietly and consistently and in a direction that the 4-page report had not captured because the 4-page report had measured what humanity was and had not asked the more important question. The more important question was what humanity was like. Those were different questions. The gap between them was where the next 40 years were going to happen. The High Council moved on to other business. The assessments came every 5 years like clockwork. The Vorath intelligence apparatus ran on schedules, and the humanity monitoring file was in the standard 5-year rotation. A full updated assessment every 5 years, brief status updates in the intervening periods, escalation triggers that would move the file to higher priority if any of the standard indicators crossed the thresholds that the framework used to flag significant developments. None of the standard indicators crossed their thresholds for the first 20 years. The assessments filed in years 5, 10, 15, and 20 all said substantially the same thing as the original 4-page report, with more data and more detail but the same essential conclusion. Humanity was developing. The development was progressing at a pace consistent with a mid-tier emerging civilization. Industrial output was growing. Technology was advancing. The military capability indicators were within the expected range for a species at this stage. Nothing requiring elevated attention. The analysts who wrote these reports were doing their jobs correctly. This was important to understand because the failure that was accumulating across those 20 years was not a failure of competence. It was a failure of the instrument being used to measure, and instruments did not fail out of laziness or oversight. They failed when the thing they were measuring had properties that the instrument had not been designed to detect. The Vorath framework had been designed over 600 years of evaluating civilizations that shared a particular fundamental characteristic. They developed toward limits. Every civilization the Vorath had ever assessed had a ceiling, a level of capability beyond which their development plateaued, not because anything external stopped them but because limits were how development worked. You built toward the edge of what your current technology, your current resources, your current organizational capacity allowed. You reached that edge. You stabilized. Sometimes you pushed the edge out a little. Incremental progress. Normal development. Expected and accountable within the framework. What you did not do, what no civilization the Vorath had ever assessed had done, was look at the edge and decide that the edge itself was the problem and that solving the edge was more interesting than anything on either side of it. Humanity did this. Not occasionally. Not as an exceptional response to specific circumstances. As a default operating mode that appeared to run at every level of their civilization simultaneously and that did not slow down or change character as their capabilities increased. If anything, it accelerated. The first indication of this was in the year 15 assessment, and it was noted in a footnote by the analyst who wrote that section. The footnote said that human technological development in the propulsion category had progressed beyond the expected trajectory in a way that did not match the standard growth model. The analyst attributed it to a fortunate research convergence, multiple lines of investigation producing complementary results, and moved on. The year 20 assessment had 3 similar footnotes. Different categories. The same pattern of development exceeding the expected trajectory by margins that the standard model attributed to favorable circumstance. Nobody read the footnotes as a pattern because footnotes were where analysts put the things that didn't fit the main analysis, and the main analysis was running correctly and generating expected outputs. The year 25 assessment was written by a different analyst. His name was Senior Assessor Tom Wright, and he had been transferred to the Humanity file from a mid-tier civilization account where he had spent 8 years developing a particular analytical habit, reading the footnotes of his predecessors before he started his own assessment to see what had been quietly accumulating in the margins. He read the footnotes from the previous 5 assessments. He sat with them for 2 days before he started writing. What he saw in the footnotes was not anomalies. What he saw was a consistent pattern that had been filed as anomalies because the main analytical framework had nowhere to put it. Development exceeding expected trajectory. Not in one category, not in one period. Across categories, across periods, consistently and without the plateau that the framework predicted would follow any significant developmental advance. He tried to model it. He took the framework standard growth model and adjusted the parameters to see if he could find a configuration that produced the observed pattern as a normal output. He couldn't. The standard model was built on the assumption that development progressed toward limits and stabilized. Every parameter configuration he tried produced stabilization somewhere. The Humanity data didn't stabilize. It kept going. He wrote a note in his working file that said the data was not consistent with the standard model and that either the data had systematic errors or the standard model had an assumption that didn't apply to this species. He spent a week checking the data for systematic errors. The data was clean. He started writing his assessment on the assumption that the standard model had an inapplicable assumption and that he needed to figure out what that assumption was before he could produce an accurate analysis. The assumption, as best he could reconstruct it from 6 centuries of Vorath analytical literature, was this: civilizations developed toward capability limits because limits were how development worked. Resources were finite. Organizational capacity had ceilings. Physical and engineering constraints defined what was and wasn't possible at any given technological level. All of this was true. The inapplicable part was the implied conclusion that limits, once reached, were accepted. The Vorath had accepted their own limits in the sense that they had developed to an extraordinary level and maintained that level. Other civilizations they had assessed had reached their respective levels and maintained those levels. The acceptance was not passive defeat. It was simply the normal relationship between a civilization and its current ceiling. Humanity appeared to have a different relationship with ceilings. Tom wrote this up carefully in his year 25 assessment. Not in the main analysis. He was not confident enough in the conclusion to put it in the main analysis where it would be read by the review board without the full context of how he had arrived at it. He put it in the supplementary analysis section where longer-form observations lived, and he wrote it with the careful hedging of an analyst who knew he was working at the edge of what his framework could support. He wrote, "The development pattern observed in human space over the past 25 years is inconsistent with the standard model in a specific and consistent way. The inconsistency suggests that humans may have a fundamentally different orientation toward developmental limits than the civilizations on which the standard model was built. Where other assessed civilizations develop toward limits and stabilize, human development appears to treat limits as problems to be addressed rather than parameters to be optimized within. The practical implication of this, if the pattern continues, would be a development curve that does not follow the standard trajectory." He filed the assessment. The review board read the main analysis. The main analysis said what the previous 4 assessments had said, with more data. Development continuing. Progress within expected range. No elevated strategic significance. The supplementary section was long and carefully written, and it sat at the back of the document where supplementary sections sat and where they were read thoroughly in approximately 1 review out of every 5. This was not that review. Tom's observation sat in the supplementary section of the year 25 Humanity assessment and accumulated the specific kind of institutional invisibility that well-filed documents accumulated when they were ahead of the moment and the moment had not yet arrived to make them visible. The moment was coming. It was 15 years away, and it was going to arrive in the form of a routine border assessment that returned figures so far outside the expected range that even the main analysis couldn't file them in the background. But for now the framework said what it had always said. And the footnotes kept accumulating. And in human space the ceiling-as problem orientation kept running at every level of a civilization that had been treating its own planet's limits as engineering problems for 10,000 years and had never developed the habit of accepting a limit as final just because it was currently in place. The Vorath did not know this. They were good at a lot of things. Reading the footnotes was not one of them. Assessor Len had been doing border assessments for 16 years. She was not the most senior analyst in the Vorith intelligence apparatus, and she was not the least senior. She occupied the middle tier of a large and well-organized institution, experienced enough to have developed reliable professional instincts, junior enough that her reports went through 2 layers of review before they reached anyone who made decisions. She was precise and thorough and had a reputation among her colleagues for taking longer than average to file her assessments because she checked her numbers more times than average before she was satisfied with them. The border assessment for the human adjacent corridor was a routine quarterly filing. The corridor was not a high-priority account. It was adjacent to human space, and human space was in the standard monitoring rotation and had been generating unremarkable assessments for 40 years. The quarterly corridor filing was the kind of work that experienced analysts did on established accounts where the expectation was continuity and the job was to document that continuity accurately. Len pulled the data, ran the standard analysis, and looked at the figures. She looked at them for a while. Then she ran the analysis again because her first instinct when something looked wrong was to check whether the instrument was working correctly rather than immediately concluding that the instrument was right and the world was different. The second run produced the same figures. She pulled the previous 5 quarterly filings for the corridor and compared the figures across the sequence. The sequence showed a trajectory. The trajectory showed a rate. The rate had been consistent across all 5 previous quarters and was well within the expected range and had been generating normal quarterly reports accordingly. The current quarter's figures were not consistent with that rate. Not slightly inconsistent. Not in the way that normal variation produced small deviations from projected trajectories that fell within acceptable modeling margins. Inconsistent by a margin that the modeling system flagged with the yellow notation it used for figures that were outside the normal variance range and required analyst review before the assessment could be filed. Len looked at the yellow notation. She had received yellow notations on assessments before. Every analyst did. They were usually resolved by checking the data source for errors or by identifying an external factor that explained the deviation, a trade route change affecting economic figures, a political event affecting movement patterns, any of the dozen routine things that produced short-term deviations from projected trajectories. She checked the data sources. She looked for external factors. Nothing in the current period's event log explained a deviation of this magnitude. She checked the figures a third time. Same numbers. She wrote a brief escalation notice, the standard format for flagging a filed assessment as requiring senior review before it was processed into the normal reporting stream. She attached the assessment, attached the 5 previous quarterly filings for comparison, and sent it up the review chain with a note that said the deviation was outside normal variance and she had been unable to account for it through standard explanatory factors. The escalation reached the senior review desk within the hour. The senior reviewer looked at Len's figures and compared them to the previous filings and sent it up another level. 2 days later it was in front of the High Council's Intelligence Review Board. The board chair read the escalation notice and the assessment and the 5 comparison filings. She was a methodical person and she read all of it before she said anything. When she finished she asked the board's senior analyst to produce a preliminary assessment of what the figures implied about the current state of human space development. The preliminary assessment came back in a week. It was careful and heavily qualified and said that if the border corridor figures were accurate indicators of broader development patterns in human space, then the trajectory they implied was significantly different from the trajectory the standard monitoring assessments had been projecting. The board chair read the preliminary assessment and commissioned the full updated assessment of human space. Full assessments were different from standard monitoring assessments. Where monitoring assessments worked from existing data and documented continuity, full assessments built the picture from scratch, pulling data from every available source, cross-referencing multiple independent indicators, applying the comprehensive analytical framework that the apparatus reserved for situations where the standard framework had produced a gap between projection and reality. The full assessment took 3 months. 3 months during which the board received brief status updates from the assessment team that were carefully neutral in language but that carried in their carefulness the specific quality of updates written by people who are seeing something develop in the data and who are not ready to say what it is until they have confirmed it thoroughly. The assessment arrived on a Tuesday morning. The board chair scheduled a full session for Thursday. All board members present. The session was listed in the administrative calendar as a standard review session with no special designation because the board chair was a cautious person and she did not want the designation to shape how the members came into the room before they had read the document. She sent the assessment to all members with a request that they read it completely before Thursday. They read it. The session opened on Thursday morning with the standard procedural formalities, and then the board chair said she wanted to begin with reactions before moving to analysis because she thought reactions were the honest starting point for this particular document. Nobody disagreed. The reactions took 40 minutes. They were measured and professional because these were professional people who dealt in measured reactions as an occupational requirement. But measured professional reactions still communicated what they communicated, and what the 40 minutes communicated was that every member of the board had read the same document and had arrived at the same place, and the same place was a place that none of them had expected to be sitting in on a Thursday morning. The analysis ran for 6 hours after the reactions. The session had been scheduled for 3 hours. Nobody suggested cutting it short. The assessment described human development across 40 years with the comprehensive detail of a document that had been built from the ground up rather than from an update of existing projections. The industrial figures, the research output, the territorial expansion, the infrastructure development, the military capability indicators. All of it in the full context of what it actually showed rather than how it compared to the expected trajectory. What it showed was a civilization that had been developing for 40 years without the stabilization that the Vorath framework predicted at every stage of development. Not developing slowly toward stabilization. Not developing with stabilization somewhere clearly ahead in the projection window. Developing with a trajectory that, when the assessment team had run the projections forward, continued to rise at a rate that had not decreased in 40 years and showed no indicators of approaching the plateau that was supposed to follow every significant capability advance. The senior analyst on the assessment team had written a section in the middle of the document that the board chair read twice. It said that the team had applied every variation of the standard framework model to the human data and had been unable to produce a projection that fit the observed trajectory. It said that the team's conclusion was that the standard framework's core assumption about developmental limits did not appear to apply to human development, and that without that assumption the model did not produce a reliable forward projection. It said that the team had attempted to produce a forward projection using an alternative model that removed the stabilization assumption, and that the result of that projection was a picture that the document included in the appendix. The board chair had turned to the appendix during her first read and had looked at the projection for a long time. The projection was not a threat assessment. The document was careful to say this clearly and multiple times. Humanity was not currently a match for Vorath capability. The projection was not describing a present situation. The projection was describing a trajectory. A trajectory that, if followed forward at the rate and with the orientation that 40 years of data documented, would eventually produce a picture that had not existed in the known galaxy in 600 years. Something that the Vorath would need to take seriously. Not yet. The timeline the projection produced was long, and the projection was built on assumptions that could prove wrong. The assessment team had been careful about this. But the direction of the trajectory was clear. And what made the session run 4 hours over schedule was not the argument about whether the projection was accurate. It was the conversation that followed once the board had accepted that the assessment was sound, the conversation about what it meant that this had been developing for 40 years in the standard monitoring files, and the standard monitoring files had been saying nothing requiring elevated attention for every one of those 40 years. The board chair asked Len's escalation report to be pulled and read into the session record. She asked the assessment team to go back through the previous standard monitoring assessments and identify the earliest point at which the data had begun showing indicators that the current assessment had used to build its picture. The team came back with an answer the following morning. The answer was year 7. Year 7 of the standard monitoring rotation had data that, read with the analytical approach the current assessment had used, showed the beginning of the pattern. Not conclusively. Not in a way that would have supported the full assessment's conclusions on its own. But the seed of it was there in the year 7 data, and it was there in every assessment after that, and it had been growing in the background of the standard monitoring files for 33 years while the standard monitoring files reported nothing requiring elevated attention. The board chair sat with this for a long time. Then she said they needed to talk about what to do next. The room had been quiet for a while already. It got quieter. The meeting request arrived on a Wednesday morning. Ray Cole was at his desk when it came through on the formal diplomatic channel. The channel reserved for official communications between recognized parties that required the full documentation trail that formal proceedings generated. He read it once and then read it again, not because he had missed anything but because the specific language of the request warranted a second reading, and he wanted to be certain he was reading it correctly. Formal bilateral meeting. Those 3 words carried institutional weight that went back 200 years in Vorath diplomatic practice. The Vorath maintained a precise taxonomy of meeting types, each category with its own protocols, its own procedural requirements, its own implicit communication about the relationship between the parties convening it. Standard contact sessions were for routine diplomatic business between parties in the normal member relationship. Consultative sessions were for situations requiring more substantive exchange. Observer sessions, advisory sessions, coordination sessions. Each had its place in the taxonomy. Formal bilateral sat at the top. The category the Vorath used when both parties were at the table in the same fundamental capacity. Equal footing. Equal standing. The kind of meeting you called when you were prepared to sit across from something and treat it as what it was rather than what your institutional framework had previously categorized it as. Ray had known this category existed. He had studied the Vorath diplomatic taxonomy in his first year in the role because studying the frameworks that shaped how other civilizations conducted their diplomacy was basic professional preparation. He had noted the formal bilateral category and its history, and he had filed it in the part of his understanding that held things which were theoretically relevant but practically distant. It was no longer practically distant. He read the request a third time and then set it down and looked at the window for a moment. 12 years. He had been in this office for 12 years, and he had been watching the signals for most of those 12 years, and the signal that the request represented was the one he had been watching for specifically. Not with impatience, with the patient attention of someone who understood that the signal would come when the data required it to, and that data required things on its own timeline regardless of what any individual wanted. He typed his acceptance of the meeting request and sent it before he did anything else because the acceptance was the immediate professional obligation, and he handled immediate professional obligations before he thought about anything else. Then he called his senior staff together and they spent the afternoon preparing. The preparation was thorough. Not anxious, thorough. Ray had a clear picture of what the meeting was and what it required, and the preparation served that picture. He reviewed everything his office had on the current state of the Vorath assessment process. He reviewed the signals he had been tracking for 12 years and organized them into the most current version of the picture they produced. He thought carefully about what the Vorath wanted to understand from the meeting and what humanity needed to communicate and how those two things related to each other. By evening he had what he needed, and he sent his staff home and spent an hour alone in his office doing the thing he always did before a significant meeting, reducing everything he had prepared to its essential core so that in the room he would be present rather than managing a checklist. The essential core was simple. Tell the truth. Answer what is asked. Don't perform. The Vorath diplomatic facility was on the far side of the coalition station from the human delegation's offices, a deliberate geography from the station's original design that placed different civilizations' primary spaces at appropriate distances. Ray walked the corridor with his two senior staff members and arrived 3 minutes before the scheduled time because 3 minutes early was his standard, and he saw no reason to change his standard for this meeting. The Vorath lead diplomat met them at the entrance. His name was in the official record as Senior Envoy Tave, a tall, precise figure who moved with the specific economy of someone who had been doing this for a long time and had reduced every unnecessary element from how they operated. He greeted Ray in the standard formal manner and led them to the meeting room. The room was formal in the Vorath style, clean lines, nothing decorative, a table that sat 6 with 3 positions on each side, lighting that was even and clear. The Vorath had 3 representatives. Ray had 2 staff members with him. The symmetry was deliberate and communicated the same thing the meeting category communicated. They sat. The Vorath opened. What followed in the first hour was the careful and structured question sequence that the Vorath diplomatic tradition used for formal bilateral openings, a series of inquiries designed to establish the factual landscape of the parties' current positions before moving to substantive discussion. The questions were framed in the precise and courteous language that Vorath formal procedure required, and Ray answered each one in the same direct way. He had been in enough diplomatic sessions to recognize the architecture of what was being built through the question sequence. The Vorath were methodical. They were not asking randomly. They were constructing a picture from multiple angles, asking about human territorial interest through questions about settlement development, asking about military posture through questions about defense infrastructure, asking about long-term intentions through questions about research priorities and expansion timelines. Every question was technically about something specific and practically about something broader. Ray answered the specific question accurately and completely and let the broader question answer itself through the accuracy of the specific answer. He did not play to the broader question, did not try to shape the picture the Vorath were building, did not use any of the standard diplomatic techniques for managing what information landed where. He just answered what was asked. His senior staff member had noted in the prep session that this approach required trusting the picture that accurate answers would build. Ray had said that was exactly the point. By the end of the first hour the picture was built. Not complete in every detail but clear in its essential shape. The Vorath had enough accurate information to understand humanity's current position and direction, and the question sequence began moving toward the more substantive territory of what each party wanted from the relationship going forward. This was where the questioning became more careful. The Vorath did not ask directly what humanity wanted. Direct questions about wants and intentions were not part of Vorath formal bilateral procedure. The procedure was designed around the principle that parties revealed their positions through the answers they gave to precisely constructed questions rather than through direct declaration. Ray understood this. He answered the precisely constructed questions precisely, and the answers said clearly what humanity wanted: to develop without interference from parties who had categorized humanity based on a 40-year-old assessment that the current data did not support. To have its settlements respected as the settlements of a civilization that had standing. To be engaged as what it currently was rather than what a 4-page report had described in a period that predated most of what humanity had built. He said all of this through the answers to the questions that were technically about other things. Then the second hour concluded and the Vorath lead diplomat indicated they had reached the point in the session where humanity could put its own questions. Ray had one question. He had known since the prep session that he had one question and that he was going to ask it at this point in the meeting and that it was going to land differently than anything else in the 3 hours. He looked at the Vorath lead diplomat directly. He said, "What do you want?" Not what do you want from this meeting. Not what does the High Council want from the relationship going forward. What do you want? The question addressed to the Vorath as directly as possible in the simplest possible language. The room was quiet. The quality of the quiet was different from the quality of the pauses that had punctuated the previous 2 hours. Those pauses had been the normal rhythm of a formal proceeding. Space between exchange, the breath that professional communication took between questions and answers. This quiet was different. Longer. And different in the way of something that was not a pause in the rhythm but a disruption of it. The Vorath lead diplomat was still. His 2 colleagues were still. Ray waited. He was good at waiting. He had learned that the question was the complete action and that anything added to it while waiting for the answer was a subtraction from the question, and he was not going to subtract from this one. The quiet held. He thought about how the Vorath had operated for 600 years. The dominance that had been so total and so long-standing that the question of what they wanted had not been meaningfully asked by anyone else in a very long time because asking it required a standing that nobody had previously occupied at this table. That was the weight in the quiet. Not the difficulty of the question. The unfamiliarity of being asked it by something that had the standing to ask and was asking directly and was waiting for an answer without showing any sign of filling the silence with something easier. Eventually the Vorath lead diplomat said that the High Council would need to deliberate before providing a complete response to that question. Ray said he understood. He said humanity would be available whenever the High Council was ready. The 3rd hour completed the formal closing procedures of the bilateral session. The procedural language that bookend these meetings, the filing of the official session record, the exchange of formal closing courtesies. Ray walked back through the corridor to his office with his 2 staff members. Neither of them said anything in the corridor. There was a particular quality of silence that followed significant moments, and all 3 of them recognized it and let it be what it was rather than filling it. Back in his office, Ray sat at his desk and looked at the session notes his staff had taken. His senior staff member said the meeting had gone well. Ray said yes. He said, "They've never been asked that question by something that had the standing to ask it and meant it and was prepared to wait for the answer." His staff member asked how long he thought the Vorath would deliberate. Ray said he didn't know. He said it would take as long as it took, and that was fine because humanity had waited this long and had nowhere more important to be. He turned to his correspondence. The deliberation would take 11 days. He didn't know that yet. But he had waited 12 years. 11 days was nothing. The 11 days of Vorath High Council deliberation were the quietest 11 days in Ray Cole's diplomatic career. Not quiet in the sense that nothing was happening. Quiet in the sense that the thing that was happening entirely behind closed doors in the Vorath Council chamber, and Ray had no visibility into it and no channel through which to inquire about it and nothing to do but continue his normal work and wait for the Vorath to reach whatever conclusion they were going to reach. He continued his normal work. He answered correspondence. He attended 2 scheduled coalition sessions on unrelated matters. He had 3 meetings with his staff about ongoing diplomatic files that had nothing to do with the Vorath and gave those meetings his full attention because they deserved his full attention and because the alternative, spending 11 days focused entirely on what was happening in a room he had no access to, was not a productive use of time or mental energy. His assistant Lisa asked him on day 4 how he was doing with the weight. He said fine. She looked at him with the expression of someone who had worked closely with a person long enough to know the difference between fine and had determined which one this was. He said, "I've been waiting 11 years for the Vorith to read their own assessment data correctly. 11 more days is not a significant addition to that timeline." Lisa accepted this and went back to her desk. On day 6, a junior member of Ray's staff flagged an item in the galactic news feeds. A brief report noting that the Vorith High Council was in an extended closed session of unusual duration. The report was from a political monitoring service that tracked council activity as part of its coverage of Vorith affairs. The report had no detail beyond the duration observation because nobody had detail beyond the duration observation. The Vorith Council's deliberations were not conducted in public, and the institution had maintained that practice for 600 years without exception. Ray read the report. He noted that 11-day closed sessions were apparently unusual enough to generate press coverage. He filed this as information about Vorith institutional norms and went back to his correspondence. On day 9, the Vorith diplomatic office sent a brief communication to Ray's office. It said that the High Council's deliberations were proceeding and that the human diplomatic office would be notified when a conclusion had been reached. It thanked Ray for his patience. Ray wrote back a 2-sentence response thanking them for the update and confirming that Humanity's diplomatic office was available at any time. He sent it and looked at his calendar for a moment and then looked at the window of his office that faced the approach corridor of the Coalition station. He had been in this office for 12 years. He had spent those 12 years doing exactly what a diplomatic representative was supposed to do, representing humanity's interests in the Coalition's collective processes, building and maintaining relationships with other member species, handling the ongoing work that interstellar diplomacy generated continuously regardless of what else was happening. He had also spent those 12 years watching the Vorith. Not with hostility. Not with the specific alertness of someone managing an active threat. With the patient attention of someone who understood that the most significant relationship on the board was the one that had not yet fully declared itself and that the shape of that relationship would eventually matter more than any of the other work on the calendar. He had read the Vorith intelligence assessments of humanity. Not the classified ones, those he did not have access to. But the signals that assessments produced were visible in behavior if you knew what to look for, and Ray had been looking for 11 years. The shift in how Vorith diplomatic staff engaged with the human delegation in Coalition sessions. The change in the questions that the Vorith Border Monitoring Service had begun asking through official channels 2 years ago. The specific language the Vorith High Council had used in the bilateral meeting request. Formal bilateral, equal standing, the category that had not been used in 200 years. He had been reading the signals for 11 years and building a picture of what the Vorith were seeing in their own data and when they were going to finish seeing it clearly enough to do something about it. The bilateral meeting request had been the confirmation that they were there. The 11 days of deliberation was the Vorith doing what the Vorith did when they had decided something, working through it completely and thoroughly before they put it on record. On day 11 the communication came through at 0840 in the morning. The Vorith diplomatic office requested a formal session at humanity's earliest convenience to present the High Council's conclusion. The communication was courteous and precise and used language that told Ray, before he read the session agenda, what the conclusion was going to be. He sent back a confirmation for that afternoon. Then he called Lisa into his office and told her what was happening and asked her to notify the relevant staff and prepare the formal documentation that a recognition ceremony required. Lisa asked what kind of documentation. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would have it ready by noon. The session was held in the Vorith diplomatic facility on the Coalition station, neutral ground, which was itself part of the message. The Vorith were deliberate about every element of their formal proceedings, and the choice of location communicated the same thing the session agenda communicated and the same thing the specific phrasing of the High Council's conclusion communicated when the Vorith lead diplomat read it into the record. Recognition. Not a conditional acknowledgement with review provisions. Not a temporary status designation pending further assessment. A formal bilateral recognition, the kind that named both parties clearly, established the terms of mutual regard, and created a framework for the relationship going forward. The document was 12 pages. Ray had read it in full before the session began. He had read it twice. It was precise and complete in the way of something that had been 11 days in the writing and that had been written by people who took precision seriously. The Vorith lead diplomat read the key provisions into the session record. Ray listened. The formal language of the document was the language of 6 centuries of Vorith institutional practice, and it was not casual, but it was clear, and it said what it meant without ambiguity. Humanity was recognized as a peer civilization. Territorial boundaries were established and mutually respected. The framework for ongoing relations was defined by terms that acknowledged both civilizations as parties with standing, not one guiding the other, not one tolerating the other, but two civilizations in a relationship that reflected what each of them actually was. Ray signed the document. His signature was the standard diplomatic signature: name, title, date. The same signature he had put on hundreds of documents across 12 years. He signed it with the same pen he used for everything else. The Vorath lead diplomat signed below him. The document was filed in both civilizations' formal records simultaneously. The recognition ceremony had been announced through official channels the previous day, and the attendance reflected what that announcement had communicated to everyone who heard it. Every coalition member species had sent a representative. Several non-member civilizations had requested observer status and been granted it. The observation gallery of the diplomatic facility was full in a way it had never been full for any session Ray had attended in 12 years. The watching was a specific kind of watching. Not the polite attention of officials attending a formal proceeding. The attentive, focused watching of people observing something that they understood was changing the shape of the world they lived in and that they wanted to be present for because being present mattered and because something should be witnessed. The Vorath had not recognized another species as an equal in 600 years. The last time had been lost to history in the sense that nobody in the current era had living memory of it, and the records from that period were fragmentary. This recognition was going to be fully documented and widely witnessed and was going to sit in the historical record with complete clarity for as long as records were kept. Ray exchanged the formal closing courtesies with the Vorath lead diplomat. They were both professionals, and the courtesies were performed with the mutual precision of two people who understood the weight of what had just been done and were choosing to close the formal portion of it correctly. Then the session concluded. Ray walked back to his office through the corridor of the coalition station where the normal traffic of a functioning diplomatic installation was moving around the significance of what had just happened in the way that normal traffic always moved around significance. Unaware of it in individual terms but part of it in aggregate. He sat at his desk. Lisa knocked and came in. She was carrying coffee, which was either coincidence or the attentiveness of someone who had worked with a person for long enough to know exactly when coffee was the right thing to bring. She set it on his desk and asked how it felt. Ray picked up the coffee. He drank some of it. He looked at the window and the approach corridor beyond it and thought about 12 years of watching signals and reading assessments and building a picture of a moment that had just become a completed fact in the historical record. He said it felt like something that was 11 years overdue. Lisa smiled and went back to her desk. Ray turned to his computer. He had correspondence to answer. He had 3 meetings tomorrow on files that had nothing to do with the Vorath and that deserved his full attention. He had the ongoing work of being humanity's representative in a galactic community that had just changed its fundamental structure in a specific and documented way. He opened the first item in his correspondence queue. Then he looked at the signed recognition document sitting in its file on his desk for a moment. 12 pages. 12 years of work. Humanity had not asked to be recognized. They had simply kept developing until recognition was the only accurate option available. The Vorath had read their own assessment data correctly and done what the data required, and the result was 12 pages of formal language that said what everyone who had been paying attention had known was true for at least a decade. Ray put the document in the file where it belonged. He went back to his correspondence. There was always work to do. That hadn't changed.